The ocean was once seen as the saviour of our small island, acting as a natural moat and protector from foreign invasion. But as time passed, this stretch of water dividing us from Europe no longer proved to be an obstacle.
France must destroy the English monarchy, or expect itself to be destroyed by these intriguing and enterprising islanders. Let us concentrate all our efforts on the Navy and annihilate England. That done, Europe is at our feet.
Thankfully, Napoleon's plans to invade Britain were thwarted by our Royal Navy with the help of Nelson and, of course, his flagship, Victory. Hi, I'm Craig Rowe and I'll be showing you around HMS Victory, which, believe it or not, is almost 250 years old and still officially in service with the Royal Navy. Later, I'll be joined by Peter Goodwin, curator and naval historian. But first, let's find out more about the ship's history. In 1756, Britain went to war with France, a conflict that later became known as the 7 Years' War and was to be fought on an intercontinental scale. Now, to expand the fleet, the Admiralty Board ordered 12 new line of battleships in London on December the 13th, 1758. The Victory, a first-rate ship of 100 guns, was one of these ordered. Victory was designed by Sir Thomas Slade, senior surveyor of the Royal Navy, between 1755 and 1771, and was built in Chatham Dockyard in Kent. But before work could begin, they had to find enough wood. Trees were selected by shape and size to provide a combination of curved and straight timbers. Once all the trees were felled, they had to be transported to Chatham Dockyard where they could season before being converted into the correctly shaped components for the ship. The Victory was built at a total cost of £63,176. That's around £4.5 million in today's money. She was designed to carry a crew of 850 men and 100 guns. Now, the length of the hull is 226 feet and she's 52 feet wide. Victory used approximately 4 acres of sail. That equates to 1 1/3 football pitches. And if the rope needed for the rigging was laid end to end, it was stretched for 26 miles. Now that is the same length as the Channel Tunnel. Victory's active service began with her involvement in the American War of Independence, with her first engagement in July 1778. In 1793, a revolutionary France declared war on Britain, and Victory, under Admiral Hood, became the flagship of the Mediterranean fleet, participating in the blockade of Toulon, which at the time was besieged by an ambitious army officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. Victory also saw action at the sieges of Bastia and Calve on the island of Corsica, at which a young Nelson was present. In 1797, as flagship of Admiral Jervis, she fought a decisive battle against the Spanish off Cape St. Vincent. After extensive refit between 1801 and 1803, she then took station in the Mediterranean under the command of Vice Admiral Nelson, prior to her famous encounter off Cape Trafalgar on the 21st of October, 1805. After the battle, she had extensive repairs and then returned to active service until 1812, thereafter residing in Portsmouth Harbour. Now, in 1922, she was moved to this dry dock to undergo a complete restoration. Victory is still here today in all her former glory, so let's take a closer look. Here it is, a beautifully restored living reminder of life on board a Georgian warship. The Victory you see before you has been restored to her fighting condition, which shows us how she would have looked at the time of Trafalgar. Now, for our tour, we begin at the stern of the upper gun deck, where we find the great cabins. This is the most luxurious part of the ship, and also the place where successive admirals would have planned their battle strategies. Come with me and I'll show you round. This cabin is where Lord Nelson worked, dined and slept. Nelson became one of the greatest naval heroes of all time. Previous successes meant he was admired throughout England and was famously known for his ability to inspire men of the highest rank as well as the lowest. Many believe this universal compassion was the key to his countless victories. However, it was here on board HMS Victory that his greatest and last battle was fought. On the 13th of September 1805, he was called to lead the Royal Navy into battle against the French and the Spanish, which later would become known as the Battle of Trafalgar. And I'll tell you more about that later on. Here in the day cabin is where Admiral Lord Nelson would have done much of his daily work. It is believed that it was round this circular table that he wrote his final prayer on the morning of the 21st of October 1805, before the Battle of Trafalgar. This uniform coat is a replica of the one that Nelson wore when he was shot at the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, by today's standards, he wasn't a tall man at all, just 5'6". When the ship went into battle, this cabin became part of the upper gun deck, and all the furniture and fittings had to be removed to allow the gunners to do their work. The dining table was dismantled into sections, the chairs were folded flat, and the panelling was secured to overhead beams. In here, he would entertain foreign dignitaries and the captains of the ships under his command. This area of the ship is still used today by the second Sea Lord for his official functions. A portrait of Lady Emma Hamilton also hangs here. Lady Hamilton became Nelson's mistress, and he called this portrait his guardian angel. Lady Hamilton and Nelson had a daughter, Horatia, seen here, aged just 3 years old. And the other remaining painting in this cabin is Lord Nelson himself after Beechey. It shows him a Vice Admiral of the Blue in 1801. Let's now go and have a look and see where Nelson would have slept. Senior officers of the Royal Navy would sleep in a cot just like this. It is simply a hammock fitted with wooden sides, but it served another purpose. If the officer died while he was at sea, it would become his coffin. It would be weighted with a round shot, and he would be given a Christian burial over the side of the ship. Now, drapes like these were made by wives, girlfriends and mistresses to brighten up sleeping in what could become your coffin. Now, these drapes are an exact replica of the ones made for Nelson by Lady Hamilton, and the originals can be seen at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Nelson's servants were always close by. They lived here in the steerage. Now let's go one deck up, because directly above the day cabin is the captain's accommodation. Now, this cabin was used by Captain Hardy, who, like Nelson, had separate day, dining and bed space, and it was actually Captain Hardy, not Nelson, who commanded HMS Victory during the Battle of Trafalgar. He was a close friend of Nelson's, but unlike his superior, he stood at a very tall 6 feet and 4 inches. So you can imagine these low ceilings of Victory must have been really awkward for him. Now, because the captain was required to be on call at all times when the ship was at sea, Hardy's cabin opened directly onto the quarterdeck, and that is where we're headed now. So we're now standing on Quarterdeck, and this would have been the nerve centre during battle. And it's also from here that Lord Nelson commanded the fleet during the Battle of Trafalgar. The raised deck of the stern is called the poop, and it's from here that duty officers would have positioned themselves to gain a good view of the upper gun deck, the sails, masts, rigging, and the sailors working on the ship. Now, it's also from here where signals would have been sent using the yard arm of the mizzenmast to hoist signal flags. The most famous flag signal was ordered by Lord Nelson just before the Battle of Trafalgar. The flag spelt out a message to the fleet: England expects that every man will do his duty. This phrase later became synonymous with Nelson. Now, halfway up the masts are platforms called tops, used to spread topmast rigging. During battle, though, this is where sharpshooters with muskets would be stationed, so they were able to fire down on enemy ships. Now, around the sides of this deck is splinter netting. Now, this is where the crew's hammocks were placed during battle. and this would give protection to those who were fighting from up here. This part of the quarterdeck is where victory was navigated from. Here we find the ship's wheel, and the cabinet in front here is the binnacle and contains two magnetic compasses which are illuminated at night by this lantern. Now victory would be steered referring to the compasses and using the large double wheel. In normal sailing conditions, 4 men could steer the ship, but in rough conditions up to 8 men would be needed to turn it. The original wheel was shot away during the early part of the Battle of Trafalgar, so the ship then had to be steered from the gun room on the lower gun deck, 3 decks below, using ropes, blocks and tackle. On the 21st of October 1805 at 06:22, Victory signalled the fleet to prepare for action, at which point all ships cleared for battle. Men cleared away loose items of furniture and doused cooking fires. Sand was thrown onto every deck to help prevent fire and to stop men from slipping on blood from the wounded and dead. Muskets, cutlasses, axes and pistols were brought to the guns. It wasn't, however, until 11 o'clock that Victory's crew were beat to quarters and the men stood by their guns. I'm now joined by Peter Goodwin, who's going to tell us more about how the Battle of Trafalgar unfolded. Now, Peter, what was it like up here during the battle?
Being a very open deck, it was quite horrendous actually, because while you're standing here going into the battle, there'll be shots screaming and droning through the air, ripping through the rigging and slamming into the masts. And as each gun fired, the flame out from the vents would scorch the beams overhead and fill the whole of the gun decks with a thick, acrid, sulphurous smoke in which these men had to be working in.
Gosh, and also I'm just thinking as well, it must have been really loud.
Immensely, immensely. It is reported that the battle could be heard 60 miles inland in Spain.
Wow. How would the men know what they were doing? It must have been mayhem.
Because all the men were well trained in rehearsing what they were doing. And remember, they're doing all this. And all the time there is shot coming into this deck, splinters flying. There were grenades thrown onto this deck, and there were even fires burning forward on the forecastle. So not a very safe place to be? Not a very safe place at all. In fact, this is the place which got the most casualties in the opening part of the battle. So like 50-odd men were injured in the first part.
So Peter, it's commonly thought that Nelson presented himself as a prominent target, but of course experiments that have been done show a different story, don't they?
Oh yes, very, very true. You've got to remember that the marksman that shot Nelson was stood in the mizzen top of the Redoutable about 40 feet away in about that direction from where we're standing. But in the heat of battle, you've got to remember there'll be a lot of smoke over this deck, not only from the firing of these guns, but all the other guns going off around as well. There will be a horizontal net covering this deck to stop debris falling onto this deck from the masts and rigging. And the two ships will be swaying alongside each other. And this man only had a sort of a space of about 6 inches to shoot through to get his Nelson on target. And so it would have been very difficult.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. This brass plaque marks the spot where Nelson fell after he was shot. He was carried 4 decks down to the orlop, where 3 hours later, sadly, he died. As an enduring tribute to Lord Nelson and to mark the anniversary of his death, the Royal Navy lay a wreath on this spot every year. Now, before we move on, let's take a look at the last few points of interest on this deck. This is the forecastle, and it's where the ship's bell is hung. This would have been rung every half hour to keep track of time, and could have been heard throughout the entire ship. It's also on this deck that you find the 2 largest guns on board. Now, these are the carronades, known by the crew as the devil guns or smashers, which is hardly surprising when we learn that they would have fired a 68-pound shot like this, and the effects would have been devastating. Now the grape shot, which had a similar effect of a shotgun but on a much larger scale, would have been fired from one of these onto the enemy ship below to rid the deck of men before the boarding party swung across to capture the ship. There were also pikes secured on the foremast and the mainmast. These would have been used to repel the enemy as they tried to board the ship. Now just beyond the forecastle is a platform nicknamed the Marine's Walk, where an armed sentry would have been stationed when the ship was at anchor. Below the Marine's Walk is the beak deck. Now this is where the only toilets available for the crew are to be found. Completely exposed to the weather, they are simply wooden boxes with holes in them. That way the waste was discharged straight into the ocean. There were no frills in the Georgian Navy. Now because they were positioned at the head of the ship, they were known as the heads, a term still used in the Royal Navy today. Now this is the sick berth located below the forecastle. Now apart from the obvious reason that being here meant you were unwell, men treated here had their daily alcohol rations stopped, so often a sick man had to be forced to come here. The sick berth was here because it was well ventilated by fresh air from the beak head and warmed by the flue head of the galley. It was also far enough away from the crew's quarters to stop the infectious diseases of the day from spreading. Now, believe it or not, more men died from disease than from battle wounds. For every one man who died in battle, nearly 40 died from disease. Now, scurvy was a huge problem due to the lack of vitamin C in the men's diets. So they were encouraged to eat lots of citrus fruits like oranges, lemons and limes, which is how the British sailors earned their nickname as limeys. Mind you, being treated here wouldn't have been much fun, as back then, medicines equated to basic herbal remedies. There was no anaesthetic, and the only antiseptic was salt rubbed painfully into wounds to prevent gangrene. Soup was available from the galley, and it was poured out as a jelly-like broth that was easy to carry. Ugh. Let's go through to the upper gun deck. Now this deck is the highest of Victory's 3 main gun decks, with 30 12-pounder guns, 15 on each side of the ship. This deck was also referred to as the main deck and was open to the elements, and it was used by the sailmaker, rope maker, armourer and carpenter. Now, a man to be very wary of during working hours was the boatswain. He would wander the decks with one of these, a rope's end, ensuring that the men were working hard and not being lazy. If an officer spotted someone not pulling their weight, he would order the boatswain to start that man, and the boatswain would then strike the crewman hard on the back of his neck and shoulders to ensure they worked harder. This type of rough treatment usually had the desired effect. Ouch. Discipline was harsh in the 18th century, a fact reflected in the Georgian Navy. Now, leg iron, or bilboes as they were called, were fitted on the decks and used to restrain men who had committed an offence. These men would have been fed on a diet of biscuits and water, and if they were to be flogged, they would have been put here 24 hours before, and then punished publicly with one of these, a cat of 9 tails. Now, even a few lashes from one of these would be enough to split the skin back to the bone, so it was no wonder that men who were given hundreds of lashes normally died, although a doctor would always be present to ensure the man didn't die instantly. That ends our tour of this deck, so we'll now go down another level to the middle gun deck to find out all about the guns on board Victory. As its name suggests, the middle gun deck lies between the other 2 main gun decks. The commissioned officers would have lived down here in a screened after section with the embarked company of Marines and selected seamen occupying the remainder of the deck. Firepower was provided by 28 24-pounder guns. Each gun had a crew of 12 who were highly trained and could fire the weapon every 90 seconds. By contrast, the ill-trained French and Spanish took 3 minutes or longer to carry out the same process. The gun crews were supported by a large number of men and boys known as powder monkeys. It was their job to ensure that each gun had a regular supply of fresh gunpowder throughout the battle. This was achieved by using labour-intensive supply lines to relevant magazines, with men passing powder cases from hand to hand. When the gun was fired, the noise was tremendous and many gunners became deaf for some hours after battle. The gun coiled viciously into the ship and was stopped from doing damage by this breaching rope. After it was reloaded, it was then run into the firing position using blocks and tickle. When a gun of this type was tested without a breaching rope, it recoiled some 50 feet. Now Peter, tell us more about this.
Right, these guns actually mainly fired solid round iron shot. This was used for structural damage to ships, overturning cannons and causing great casualties amongst the men on the decks of the ships, and also causing splinters to fly all the way through the decks, causing even greater numbers of casualties. The other things they would use, besides solid shot, was chain shot and bar shot, and this was used to damage rigging and masts. And when fired out of the gun, this would start swinging around, encircling itself, and wrap itself round shrouds and masts and bringing the whole lot crashing down.
Well, I would not want to be on the receiving end of that. That sounds horrendous.
Well, there were other things. They also had canister shots, which were tin cans filled with somewhere up to 100 musket balls. And this would hail out onto the decks of an enemy ship, cutting down and slaving down men. Alternative to that, what they could use, because these are muzzle-loading guns, and you could put anything down their bows, they will put in pieces of iron, old nuts and bolts and anything like that, and that was known as language shot. In fact, Victory is basically a large floating gun platform, and every single broadside she fired, she would loose off 1/2 ton of solid iron into the enemy. And Victory's firepower was so great that it is actually greater than the amount of artillery that Wellington had at his disposal with his army at the Battle of Waterloo.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Now, you may be wondering, how would a ship as large and as old as this have raised its anchors? Well, I'll tell you, manpower. It was a major task to raise the anchors on board Victory, as each anchor weighed 4 tons and the cables weighed 6.5 tons. Now, this all had to be carried out manually using 2 capstans mounted in the centre of the ship that would join vertically. One capstan had a total of 12 bars, the other had 14 bars. So each bar had space for 10 men, so in total 260 men on 2 levels were used to raise the anchor. Now, after all that hard work, men on board Victory would have expected a good hearty meal at the end of the day, which brings us on to the next part of the ship, the galley, where all the food was prepared. This is located at the forward end of this deck. This is the ship's galley or kitchen. The officers' meals were prepared in the pantry here, and ordinary seamen brought food they prepared in their messes to be cooked for them. The food was reasonably good and there was plenty of it. They were served 3 meals a day. There was oatmeal gruel for breakfast, fish or meat stew with beans or peas at noon, and for dinner, the ship's biscuits and cheese. Each man had a choice of between 8 pints of wheat beer, 2 pints of wine, or half a pint of watered rum, or grog as it was known. Now, meals were prepared by the ship's cooks, usually retired or disabled seamen, on this Brodie stove. Now, the stove was heated by a large firebox and open hearth, burning coal or wood. Now, the 2 huge copper kettles could hold 250 gallons of boiling meat, stew, or oatmeal gruel. A copper distiller produced 2 gallons of fresh water a day, mainly used by the surgeon. Now, preserved meats were soaked in wooden tubs to remove the brine or the salt before cooking. Although Victory took on fresh food whenever possible, it relied on stores of salted meat, fish and dried food, and you'll see examples of this throughout the ship. Now we journey down another level to the lower gun deck, where the crew of Victory ate, slept and spent most of the time when they were not on duty. Now, it's hard to believe that the deck I'm now standing on dates back to when the ship was first built, but it's true. On this deck is mounted Victory's heaviest armament, comprising a battery of 30 32-pounder guns. Around 480 men would have slept and lived down here, with each man sleeping in a hammock spread at 16-inch intervals throughout its length. Now, because the deck is so close to the waterline, the gun ports generally remain shut. Therefore, it would have been very dark and stuffy. Now, when the crew got up in the morning, they would have to lash their hammock into a long sausage shape, which had to be tight enough to pass through a specially designed hoop to make sure it would fit into the splinter netting on the upper deck, where it provided protection from musket balls and splinters during battle. At meal times, there would have been about 550 men crammed into this space. The men ate in small groups of between 4 and 8, which was known as the mess. These men would stay together until the end of the voyage and became mess mates. Each man in the group were taken in turns to be the duty cook, and it was their responsibility to collect their daily rations of food from the ship's steward and prepare the foods ready to be cooked. Now, in the early stages of the voyage, the crew would have been very pleased with the food. However, once the livestock and vegetables were consumed, the quality quickly went downhill. The meat and fish would come from barrels where it had been packed with salt to preserve it. And there were then just beans or peas. But worst of all, the cheese would have redworm and the butter would be rancid. Despite the generous supplies of alcohol, drunkenness was a serious offence in the Royal Navy, and it still is to this day. The deck was also the place where men spent most of their time. When they were not on duty, they would play games such as dice or cards. We are now going down 2 levels to the magazine and hold, where the ship's food and gunpowder supplies were kept. The front or forward of this deck was also known as the fore cockpit. It gave access to the storerooms of the boatswain, carpenter and gunner. And also it was the only way to get into the grand magazine and its light room along lead-lined passages. Let's now go down into the grand magazine. Now, this is the grand magazine. It comprises of a palleting flat and a filling room. It would have stored up to 35 tons of gunpowder contained in 784 100-pound barrels. Now, that's enough to take out a 3-mile radius of Portsmouth if it ever exploded in port. Now, I brought you over here to show you these. This is just 1/10 of the gunpowder that was used during the Battle of Trafalgar. The magazine would have supplied the charges to the larger 32-pounder guns on the lower gun deck and the 2 68-pound carronades on the forecastle. Double lined with an additional layer of copper, it was well insulated against fire, moisture and rats. If rats had got into the magazine, they would have spread gunpowder around the ship and increased the risk of fire. The ship also had 2 additional hanging magazines, the forward supplying the 24-pounder guns on the middle deck and the after supplying the 12-pounder guns on the upper gun decks and the upper deck. Now let's take a look in the hold. I'm now standing in the very bowels of the ship. Now, here at the bottom of the hold, there were blocks of heavy pig iron covered in a layer of shingle. Now, this served as a ballast to counteract the weight of the guns and the mast above. When fully stored, the hold contained enough provisions to last the ship and crew 6 months of sailing. There were barrels filled with salted beef, pork, fish and water, and then sacks of dry provisions such as oats, biscuits, peas and pulses, and casks with butter and cheese. Now, the biggest problem down here in the hold was rats. They would come on board in sacks of dried vegetables and they would have to be dealt with quickly before they bred out of control. The ship would have also carried 120 tons of shots. Just like this. Contained in 3 shot lockers situated throughout the hold and acting as an additional ballast. Returning back up on the orlop, you can see the ship's sail room and 2 cable tiers containing the ship's anchor cables. Each is 600 feet long and weighs over 6.5 tons. As you walk further along this deck, you see the midshipmen's cots and sea chests, and over to my right is one of the hanging magazines. This hanging magazine supplied ready-use cartridges for the 12-pounder guns on the upper gun deck and quarterdeck. During battle, these double doors leading into the magazine were fitted with a wetted Fear Naught cloth fire screen. Finally, we come to the after cockpit. Now, this is where the midshipmen lived. Surrounding their mess tables, you see various storerooms and cabins in which the ship's purser, the ship's steward, the captain's clerk, and the ship's surgeon, Dr. Beatty, lived. Next to Dr. Beatty's cabin is the surgeon's dispensary. In times of battle, the after cockpit was transformed into a casualty theatre, where below the ship's waterline, and safe from the effects of gunfire, the surgeon and his mate would deal with all types of injuries caused by shot, splinters, sharp-edged weapons and burns. A good surgeon could amputate an arm or a leg in 1.5 minutes. During the Battle of Trafalgar, there were 5 amputations of arms and legs and 7 more afterwards. Sadly, it was also on this deck that Lord Nelson passed away. He drifted in and out of consciousness and on 2 occasions called for Captain Hardy. The first was to ask, "How goes the battle, Hardy?" The reply was, "My lord, you have won the day." Nelson then uttered, "Thank God, I have done my duty." The second time he said to his friend, "Not over the side, Hardy, not over the side. You know what to do." Nelson wanted to be buried in England, so when he died, the surgeon solved the problem of preserving his body during the long voyage home by placing it in one of the largest barrels on board, called a water leaguer, and filling it with brandy. Now, it's impossible to predict what Great Britain would have been like if Napoleon had not been defeated. We do know, however, that the victories of Trafalgar and Waterloo in 1815 secured Britain's freedom for over a century, as well as our domination of the seas. Now, looking at victory today, I'm sure you'll agree that whilst the age of sail has long passed, her strength and beauty captures forever the golden age of seafaring that she helped to create. Goodbye.